Hi, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, AI, Lawyering and Ethics. My name is Kate Scanlon, and I'm one of the Capacity Building Coordinators at Community Legal Centres Queensland. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding today's webinar, here in Meanjin, Brisbane. They are the Turrbal and Yagara people. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. These are stolen lands and sovereignty was never ceded. Today's webinar is being viewed by people across Queensland and Australia, and I'd like to pay respects to traditional owners throughout the country and extend a warm welcome to any First Nations people who are joining us today. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Sophie Farthing from the Human Technology Institute at the University of Technology in Sydney, who will be talking to us about artificial intelligence and how it may influence our work in the community legal sector. I'll let Sophie tell you a bit more about herself shortly, but before I do that, just a little bit of housekeeping. So as I said, today's webinar is being recorded and the recording will be available on our website towards the end of the week. We encourage you to ask any questions with the question and answer panel box that's at the bottom of your control panel. I'll now hand over to Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate, and hello everyone across Queensland and Australia. It's delightful to be with you today. I am beaming in from Sydney, from Gadigal land, so in addition to Kate's acknowledgement, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I am standing on and meeting you on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extends that acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the call today. So, as Kate said, my name is Sophie Farthing. I work at the Human Technology Institute. I think I've had a job title since this changed, since this was originally advertised. So I was director of the Policy Lab, haven't been demoted, happy to say. I'm now head of the Responsible Technology program here at HTI. So I'm going to just flick forward so I can tell you a bit about HTI so you can understand the perspective from which I'm coming from. So I'm a human rights lawyer. I am not a data scientist, full disclosure. So I work with data scientists. HTI is a relatively new institute. So we're an independent institute set up at UTS here in Sydney. We're a mix. We're not an academic research institute where we do have academics. I am not one. I do not have that level of expertise either, but we're a mix of policy people, of lawyers, and then, as I said, data scientists. Are three co-directors, the former Human Rights Commissioner, Ed Santo, Professor Nick Davis, who really specialises in understanding how new technologies, particularly AI, is used in organisations and in corporate governance, and then Professor Sally Cripps is a mathematician. So what HTI is trying to do is bring together the different perspectives that are really necessary to think about this future that we have that's rapidly changing with new technology. And the goal is to make sure it's human-centred. So big topic here today and lots of you. So as Kate said, I'm as eager to hear from you as I hope you are from me. So, and because I can't do two things at once, I can do many things at once. I have three children, but what I can't do is read a chat box. So Kate, I've said to Kate to interrupt at any time. I'm really keen to hear about your thinking about AI. I'm conscious that I'll have a lot of people from across the CLC and perhaps other sectors, but I know I've got legal practitioners, have some policy people, operations, I assume, as well. So what I'm trying to do in this webinar, there is so much about AI. One of my slides is AI is everywhere all at once, and that's certainly how it feels like. And I've been working in this space now at HTI for about 3 years, and prior to that, I led a project at the Human Rights Commission on human rights and technology. So what we've seen develop over the last decade is hugely transformative. So what I'm hoping to do today is to go through some of the basics of what we're talking about when we're talking about AI. I'm going to hit some of those risks and opportunities. I'm going to talk about how organisations are using AI and what the things to think about when you're looking at using some of these AI tools. So I will Keep going. I've already done the next, already failed in not keeping up with my slides. And this is basically what I'm going to cover. So I'm hoping, I know there'll be some people who are all over AI and others who are all over how it's being used in workplaces. So hopefully this way will hit all the interests of people who are dialing in. And hopefully what we can also do is just filter out the noise a little bit when we come to thinking about these issues around AI. So my first task, I can't see many of you on the screen, so I feel like I'm talking to myself, which is always the trick with webinars, isn't it? But let's look at what artificial intelligence is. There is no fixed term. So often people talk about AI as if it's a single technology, but really what it is a cluster of mutually reinforcing technologies with mutually reinforcing capabilities, I should say. So this next slide pulls out those 4 pillars that we're really talking about when it comes to AI. And hopefully these will be familiar. But the first is that big data. So if you think of all the billions of credit card swipes, the sensor readings, the smart card data, the messages we generate every day, this is all data that feeds into machine learning. And AI feeds on this scale and variety of data. And what it's doing is learning patterns that humans themselves may not be able to spot, or they might take a lot longer to do so. So you'll hear this said that AI as a term has been around for decades, like since the 1950s. But what has accelerated over the last decade is this data collection. And really, that really started with the internet. That really supercharged this data collection. And then we had all the developments that we'll be well aware of. So when social media, that happened, all these online interactions happened, like we're really talking about data collection on steroids. And it's also the types of data that these other technologies have enabled us to collect. So it's not just, information, personal information, but it's biometric data, for example. It's when we combine different data sets, that's what we're talking about, big data and AI. So the kinds of insights that you can get when you combine credit card data with the time you're shopping at the supermarket. So the second is really where that data is. That's the second pillar, and that's the machine learning aspect of it. So machines, when we're talking about AI, talking about how algorithms turn all this raw information we have into predictive models. So things like, is this transaction fraudulent? So that's really AI working, learning from all the data it has. Is this unusual transaction? Your Netflix, excellent service in telling you what you should and shouldn't be watching next, which is tricky for me when I have kids because some of the recommendations, it's certainly not based on my watching. Really some really interesting applications in health, and I'm going to keep talking about examples so it's quite real to you. What in agricultural settings, what crop is going to need water next and how much. That's machine learning. It's giving you answers based on the data that it's learning from. And what we really are talking about here is quality data. So the machine learning outcomes are going to be governed by the kind of data. So there is a saying you may have heard, garbage data in, garbage out, garbage comes out. Then the next aspect of AI is really automation. So this is once we train the model and then we don't want to say let it loose, but in some circumstances certainly is letting it loose. And this is where the value is when it comes to AI. So it's a robotic arm that adjusts its grip in real time. Don't know if anyone saw quite recently, it was 2 Chinese universities that trained coded robots to play a soccer game. And it was their natural movement. It's worth a watch. Someone's quite sad the robots fall over and they have to get stretchered off just like regular players. But it's that kind of predictive thinking. So being able to respond and interact. So we're seeing that, for example, call center agents who are seeing the next best action pop up on the screen, software that starts routing invoices automatically. There are a lot of real-time operations of the insights that machine learning provides. And then the other aspect, again, is supercharge this AI journey that we're all on, is this massive computing power. So you would have heard about chips and developing cloud GPUs. It's this kind of technical infrastructure where all this heavy lifting happens. So that's training the large models, running them, getting outcomes in milliseconds faster than we've ever been able to get outcomes from data before. And then that scaling out to millions of users. And then it just keeps going. So as that automation accelerates, it produces more data, generates more data, more new user interactions and more user interactions and sensor readings and logs. And this loops back in to enrich those big data reservoirs. And then there's continuous improvement. So the big data goes back in, the machine learning continues, and it continues in this kind of cycle. And then, of course, at the moment, one thing I think we're all very keenly aware of is how quickly this is all now developing. So, we are mostly at the moment, publicly at least, talking about generative AI. So ChatGPT, produced by the large language model that was released in late 2022, has really changed the game in the last few years. So we're really talking about, we'll move over to this next slide to just point out the differences, because generative AI is what we're talking about, but that's not all AI. So on this side of the screen, I've got what got here, narrow AI. And this is, where there is a model that's designed, it's got a well-defined task, it's trying to achieve a particular purpose or problem. It can usually be replicated if it gets the same instructions again. And the kind of examples of, search engines, probably before Google started to use generative AI, or a recommender system. So think about your, TripAdvisor or your Trivago recommendations for which holiday you should book next. Risk assessment tools in criminal justice, they're more a narrow AI. And then what we are now seeing is the next generation of generative AI. So I don't know who has played around with generative AI tools, and you won't be alone, actually, if you say you haven't. I think a lot of people, we speak to a lot of lawyers, people across all sorts of organisations, and there are real differences. So I'm assuming on this call, we've got about 144 on the call at the moment. There will be some of you who are well versed in how generative AI works, and some who are really wary of it for good reasons. Australians, we poll really poorly in terms of trust in AI. So when we're talking about generative AI, if you have played around it, you'll see what it does. And it's just because of how it operates, it can do different tasks. It can produce intended and unintended consequences. It is generating content. It's not just predicting what might come next, but it is generating it. So I use Claude Pro, and I will ask it questions. So say you say something innocuous, I will give it a prompt. A lot is, we'd have heard about developing skills about prompts, but I'll say, I need a trip to New Zealand for a motorhome for a family of 5. I need these kids' activities. I want to go this, and this. It will generate a whole itinerary scanning all of its data across all the websites that are dedicated to New Zealand. It's quite a simplistic example, but you can see what generative AI is doing. It's producing those novel outputs, and it's a whole new wave of ability in terms of what we can do with these types of tools. And it's really an advanced branch of that machine learning in those 4 pillars that I just went through. The other type of AI that you might have heard about at the moment is agentic AI. So this is really 2025's theme when it comes to AI, and that's really understanding how it's within the automation pillar, and it is talking about AI agents deciding what action to take on its own. So it's really machines acting without that human supervision. And this is rapidly increasing. I would say it's still very much in that experimental stage. So it's agents starting to work in teams, and they use a tool, or they set up to do a task like book a restaurant or book a plane ticket. That's when we're talking about AI agents. So it is doing things on the basis of its own action. And it's the thinking and the acting that's quite hard to get your head around. I certainly find that, because it's such a step up. and it's very fast developing. So we've seen Claude's Haiku, you might have seen. So Claude is an LLM that's produced by a company called Anthropic based in the United States. And at the end of last year, it started to release publicly a model that could direct Claude to interact with computers like a person would, except it's not a person, it's an agent. We've seen, earlier this year, when we are seeing companies spit out these examples, there's a Chinese startup called Monica, and it demonstrated its agent buying real estate and converting a recording of a lecture into summary notes. So it's still experimental, it's still error-prone. But we're also, while we're seeing those examples, we're starting to see some real life impact, even though we are in that stage where it's rapidly developing. So Telstra, for example, you may have seen there have been a few announcements around its workforce. But one thing that it's in one of its recent announcements, it's using AI agents, for example, to summarize meetings, to reply to emails. It's starting to save their workers 1 to 2 hours a week. So in terms of how we've got to think about AI differently. So we do get this a lot. The co-directors set up a whole centre, not just about AI, but about technologies, but a lot of what we're doing is AI because of how different it is and how much, from a legal perspective, how much it's challenging our regulators, how our law applies. And it's these things, sorry, there are a few too many things on this slide, but really these are the things that make AI different. So when I am, talking with government, for example, and this is what government is grappling with, is this technology any different to ones we've had before? Do we need new sets of legal rules? They're the kinds of questions that governments all over the world are grappling with, some at more advanced stages than others. And these are the things that make it different. It's that opacity of existing use. It's embedded in products and services that it use. And it can make it difficult for all of us to identify existing AI use. I'm sure most of us have used it today. Anyone who's got one of these, and I'm sorry it's here on my desk, but anyone who's used their maps function today, you're using AI. The opacity of AI outcomes is a really big one, particularly for lawyers, but it's becoming difficult to understand how AI is making its connection. And that makes it difficult to do that testing, the validity validate the outcomes, explain it, and to get it to reproduce its outputs again. So with the narrow AI, that was an easier task. With generative AI, because it's constantly learning and generating new output, that's becoming increasingly difficult. The scalability and diversity of use cases. And my next slide is, AI is everywhere. So it's really challenging the way we have thought in sectors. The scalability is something that we saw in robo-debt. I'm not going to go into too much detail on robo-debt. I imagine it's something you're all very familiar with, but that was a scalability problem of a technology that was used without much governance and without proper oversight and safeguards in place. But it's the scalability, the speed with which it was able to impact thousands of people. That reliance on data is another thing that really distinguishes AI, because all technology, depends on data in some way, but it's the AI systems relying on data for both input and training. And that means there's great commercial incentive to collect that data and to use it. And then what I've just been talking about, it's that ability to operate autonomously, and that being able to take action with minimal to no human intervention. I'm not going to be talking about super intelligence in this webinar, because I'm really focusing on technology, how it's been using now, how it is being used now, and how we can both get the opportunities if we address the risks associated with it. But that is another aspect of AI that makes it very different to anything we've had before. So if you're feeling like this is a massive change, it really, really is. This next slide, again, it's just to indicate we are seeing AI used everywhere. So you're going to be experiencing this, I think, speaking with clients, but it's AI is being used by governments. So the using lots of examples to make it real and also hopefully interesting. So you don't have to listen to me, but you can think about all these great examples. But the UK, for example, has just announced in the last couple of weeks that it's going to use facial age estimation in respect of asylum applications and sham marriages. And that brings into a whole lot of questions about, how you verify age. We're about to see that debate really intensify in Australia when we talk about a social media ban. We're seeing it across all government departments. We're seeing it in policing. So I imagine some of you are in the criminal justice sector. We're seeing a lot of examples of policing, whether that be facial recognition technology, which is being used across the UK and certainly a lot of jurisdictions in the US, predictive policing tools, risk assessment. We're seeing AI being used in healthcare with incredible results. Some of you may have heard, it's one of the earliest examples of how AI was able to detect skin cancers, for example, using medical images to diagnose disease in a way that the human eye cannot see. We are seeing AI transforming banking. Credit loan applications. We're seeing retail stores use facial recognition technologies to conduct surveillance. So you may have seen a few big cases where our privacy commissioner has made a determination against Bunnings, for example, because it was collecting sensitive biometric information without the proper privacy safeguards. And that last one I've already referred to, we're all using AI. Individuals are really benefiting from AI, in those low risk settings like your Netflix, but also when I was at the Human Rights Commission doing that human rights and technology project, one of the most satisfying pieces of work we did as part of that was looking at technology for people with accessibility requirements, and just hearing how people with vision impairment in particular, one of the groups we consulted with, the kind of independence they were getting. So one example is a pair of glasses, not Mark Zuckerberg's glasses, but glasses that were developed to help people with vision impairment scan a product in a supermarket and know what the price was going to be. So we had Sean Murphy, who I'm sure won't mind me saying is the accessibility officer at Telstra, and he would talk about the independence that he was getting from these kind of AI tools. We're also seeing students. That's a whole other lecture. Our students are using AI, and then we're all the tools are there for us to use to help us in our workplaces and our personal lives. And of course, speaking to others, or certainly speaking to a lot of practices. So in the next, I'm going to move on to talk about risks and harms and governance and legal professional duties. So this slide really is thinking about how this is impacting all of you. And it's the way that we're seeing AI transform legal workplaces it's a lot to grapple with. And it's really these three aspects which makes it a really complex area to get your head around. I think it's that individual use of AI which is transforming how lawyers actually work. There are a lot of legal tools legal research tools, legal databases, contract automation. There are a lot of tools that are coming onto the market, some from really big players like LexisNexis, Thomson Reuters, that have really great tools that do the kind of work that research assistants and graduate lawyers do. It's a whole other lecture about impact on the workforce. But that kind of transformation of how legal practices do client expectations, that lawyers will be using these kinds of tools to make them more efficient. So that is having a really big impact. Of course, you'll be advising clients impacted by AI, and making an assumption, obviously, from my knowledge of the CLC sector, where I have spent some of my career, you're really advising clients who might be adversely impacted by a policing decision using AI or an administrative government decision around social service provision. There is a lot that's related to data collection and surveillance in the domestic violence context. And I know the clients that you will be advising are not those who will have the resources to do their own advocacy. There are a lot of difficulties, a lot of mass decisions and a lot of difficulties for clients knowing how AI is being used. So that is presenting a really particular set of challenges for solicitors in the CLC sector and related sectors. And I think the other thing that I have been hearing just anecdotally is happening, that you will also be getting clients come to you who know what their answer to their legal problem is. So that's a challenge as well, because they've got it through ChatGPT. I think doctors have always had this with Dr. Google. Lawyers are now having it with ChatGPT. And so it is an extra, an area of focus for all your areas of practice. And that third one is, of course, advising clients who are seeking to use AI. So it's really understanding what advice, because as we will get to in some of the later slides, it's really advising clients on what is going to be lawful, also what's going to be responsible use of AI, or to go to the title of this webinar, what's going to be ethical. And with lawyers, I would talk about your professional ethical obligations, and we'll talk a bit about that as well. I'm going to pause here briefly. Kate, I can't see the chat, so I'll pause for breath in case there are any comments that you wanted to bring to my attention.
So far, we don't have any questions yet, but I'll let you know if anything else pops up. Like we said at the beginning, guys, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them at any point, and I can read them out to Sophie. Thanks so much, Sophie.
Thank you. I'll keep going. I just want to hear the sound of someone else's voice other than my own. And I should stress there are no silly questions when it comes to this. I know hopefully this is a space where you feel you can ask anything. I may not be able to answer, that's the other thing, but feel free to pop anything in that chat. So I do want to talk just briefly about opportunities, risks and harms. HCI is really facilitative in how we think about technology and how we think about AI, but we have a pretty strong view that the risks and harms have to be addressed in order for us to get the most out of the opportunities. So this next slide it's a bit of a cheeky one, but to really reflect the flood of information that we get. So this I am finding, I'm doing this every day. And I know when I speak to others who are not doing this every day, who are trying to do their job, providing legal services to a whole swathe of clients, that there's so much noise. Like, and it is very difficult to tease through all of this. Is AI going to wipe out humanity? Like that, I think it was a Telegraph headline. There isn't going to wipe out humanity. We've had really respected AI AI researchers, had human rights practitioners come together and say, we are going to get that dystopian future which we all fear, the existential crisis. So there has been a lot of noise around that, and we can talk a little bit about that. At the same time, we're also hearing a lot about how this is going to rapidly and radically change our workforces. And it's really hard to, I think it was the CEO of Anthropic said in the last few weeks, this is going to, displace 20% of the US workforce. Huge figures. So there's a real conversation to be had. We're starting to see certainly the unions in Australia be more active around this to get some understanding of what the impact is going to be. There's been a speech just this week from one of the assistant commissioners at the ACTU, Joseph Mitchell, starting to speak more concretely about what union expectation is when AI is going to displace workers. So we're also hearing that generative AI is the key. It's going to put billions, trillions of dollars into the economy, and then we're seeing that healthcare. We're seeing AI. That's Mark Zuckerberg there down the bottom talking about loneliness and AI being the key to mental health. At the same time, we have people really concerned about human disconnect and the kind of, the mis and disinformation conversation that's happening that's really fueling a lot of social division. And then we're seeing AI, used in autonomous weapons. So it is really difficult to, channel or get through all this information and get a really good grasp. And we are really clear at HTI when we speak with governments. It is setting aside, this AI is going to wipe out humanity. It's really focusing on the here and now. That's really what we're trying to do amongst all this that's happening, all the geopolitical shifts. It's really focusing on what are the opportunities now. And I'm going to get to the next slides with some really concrete examples. And then what are the risks of harm that we need to address when it comes to AI use by governments, by companies. And I think what's really important in that is that we do have concrete examples. I'm going to flick to the next slide. I was about to launch into it before I did my swap. But I really want to talk about just some really concrete examples, because there are some amazing ones that we are seeing, some really good real life examples that demonstrate the opportunity. And that's what I was going to say. I am a human rights lawyer, so I do think about risk, harm, opportunity through that human rights lens. Not everyone does, and where the government is really grappling to define what is a risk of harm, what is going to be an AI harm. But I think I'm probably in good company here with using that human rights framework. Where can we promote and protect human rights, particularly in the sector you're working in? So thinking about those access to justice issues, that's something, because I have come from a human rights campaigning and CLC background in New South Wales. Looking at efficiencies, and I'm going to talk about these examples on the left-hand, right-hand side of my screen in a second. But we know that the sector that you service is growing and your resources are not. So are there ways that these really clever tools can create efficiencies in a way that safeguards human rights and gives you time and resources to get back to those people who you have to turn away? The two examples here, the bottom one there is actually a tool from Marrickville Legal Centre. So I have heard Vasily Maroulis, the CEO, speak. I've spoken on a panel with him last year, and Marrickville has done quite a few, they've had quite a few experiences and experiments, the wrong word, they've got quite a few projects to do with technology to really look at building in efficiencies to who they're servicing. So this AIIM, the Community Legal CRM, is one that a few legal centres, and there may be people on this call who have joined. There was a pilot program, I understand, but this is quite recent, Marrickville's most recent one, and it is looking at those streamlining those administrative processes, those basic tasks which take up an enormous amount of time. And what Vasily said when they did a press release about this, he said, he estimated an immediate benefit to thousands of people they help every year, because it reduces the time that they have to do that administrative task, which in turn reduces the amount of people they have to turn away. So I know Marrickville has got some grants from New South Wales government, and so understanding those case studies, and this is where, jump in the chat if you have examples, both of good or bad. That's where I think there's a real game changer. Otherwise, we are going to get, certainly, and it's not going to be unfamiliar, I appreciate, in the sector, but as the big firms develop their own tools, as government starts using more AI, there is a resource issue that's ever present in the sector that will get the concern. I certainly understand from people working in the sector in New South Wales that that's only going to get enhanced as we move forward, as the technology develops. The other one is an example, Joseph. It's built by Joseph AI, but it's actually a partnership with NYU and a not-for-profit housing provider in New York State. And Roxanne, the repair bot, has a very specified purpose. It is about giving tenants information about repairs for their properties. So this is not so much internally working on how the organisation works as much, but it's really about getting the right information to people who do not have the resources to go and get legal representation, for example. So there's some really good examples of how we can see how AI can be used now to address some of the problems. Like, we're certainly not an advocate for technology being the solution for every problem, but these kind of very thoughtful, well, it's well managed, really good stakeholder engagement supporting what they've actually developed are really good examples of how AI can be used in a really positive way in the sector. On the other side of the screen, and this is the thing with AI, every time you can get a good example, you end up with a bad one as well. And this is where we really have a lot of concerns about how AI, the risk of harm that we're going to see play out. So the top example is an investigation by OVIC, the Office of the Victorian Information Commissioner. Again, people may be familiar with this, but for those who aren't, this was an investigation late last year into the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. And it was investigating the use of ChatGPT by a child protection worker. I should say at the outset, I think, this is going to be an issue with people who are have incredibly large workloads, a lot of stress. So it is understandable that you will use a tool like ChatGPT if you're not aware of the risks of using it. So this particular child protection worker was preparing a report in relation to a young child whose parents were charged in relation to sexual assault offences. So OVIC ended up doing an investigation and issued a compliance notice to the department because sensitive personal information was just put into a public tool by the child protection worker, and secondly, what the tool actually produced, the results of what was put into it, and what it spat out was just like grossly, wildly incorrect. So the one example I remember, there were a couple, but a toy that what the report said, because the child protection worker put the report, put the output from ChatGPT into her report, was that was an age appropriate toy and evidence of a safe environment for the child, when actually that toy had been used in the course of the offending. So I should stress, in that case there was a positive outcome for the child in relation to that particular matter. But you can see how that goes pretty wildly, with great concern, can go wrong. What happened in that case is the department ended up banning all use of ChatGPT by its workers and any other similar types of tools. The other example is another one you may have come across, which was in relation to a chatbot created by a company called Character AI. So you may have heard a little bit about, chatbots, emotional AI companions, they're sometimes called, and they are using generative AI. I have listened to some on podcasts. I don't have any chatbot friends, but what they are, they're incredibly realistic. So this was a tragic case with a teenage boy who had developed a relationship. Obviously these tools, there are no safeguards, there are no regulations around them in terms of how they can interact. This boy ended up taking his own life, and what the mother is, there's now a social media victims law centre based in the US, and they are suing Character AI. So it's a negligence case, and there are really interesting questions around liability and responsibility. Character AI has already failed in its argument that the case should be dismissed on the grounds that it's infringement of their First Amendment's free speech rights. So there'll be some interesting questions around liability there. So they are just two examples. I better move quickly because I just realised the time. So I'm going to move on, unless Kate's going to interrupt me with any nuggets from the chat.
There's no burning questions that can't be left to the end.
I'll leave some
We
time.
just have some broader questions at the moment, so I might just hold them off till the end.
I will definitely I will move swiftly. So we are seeing AI being used a lot in workplaces. So I'm going to throw out, I'm not going to go through all these stats, but this is from recent research undertaken by KPMG and the University of Melbourne. It's a globally leading study, but what it's showing broadly is that AI is being used in workplaces quite intentionally. Some of the complacent use of AI, we've pulled out the stuff that is concerning, but this is approaching 50% of workplaces using it in inappropriate ways. People making mistakes in their work while relying on AI, or using AI in a way that contravenes policies and guidelines. So we know that AI is being used by workers in a lot of different ways. It's probably the most concerning stat I think on here is the reliance on AI to do work that they're not learning to do themselves. So accompanying this kind of research is some interesting studies that are coming out that are looking at what use of AI is doing to our critical thinking, our cognitive analysis abilities. And these are in their infancy. So this technology is developing so quickly, and of course the research, really well considered empirical research, has to catch up. But some early findings are that is damaging our skills of critical analysis. And it's a really live question for all of you. I imagine if you have junior staff, how we think about research assistants, that kind of training, it's a very live issue in universities. And the other interesting stat I think on here is that about half feeling like they're left behind if they're not using AI at work, which was surprising, I thought. But there is this constant pressure, which can, of course, go against, that thoughtful application of AI that really is really, really important when we're using these super powerful tools. Now, for lawyers, there are particular issues when it comes to generative AI that you really need to be keenly aware of. These are just general issues, and when the next slide will be about what your legal professional obligations are. These are just things to bear in mind. This first one is performance. So all these tools operate on the basis of instructions that aren't a generic set of instructions. They're what each company is instructing and how they're building their particular tool. And the goal is to give you an answer, not to give you the right answer. So that's something to bear in mind when you use these tools. As I said, I do use Claude Pro, but out of this, research that's being done, one of the researchers on critical analysis said you should think about your assistant, whatever tool you're using. So I'll think about Claude Pro as a very, very clever research assistant, but also quite naive. So it's really good to bear that in mind. Use it to help you in your work, but not deliver your outputs. This is really key that this cuts both ways. That training data can include legally protected information. So either sensitive information that is sitting there on the web that we all know. So think about OpenAI. When they developed this, they scraped everything that was available on the web, everything publicly available. So we need to bear that in mind when we're asking these tools to, particularly when it comes to legal analysis and advice. If you are using a public tool, we really, you can't put anything confidential in there, and it's really easy to do. We saw it in that OVIC case, putting in sensitive personal information. You just have to remember there are going to be a different set of considerations depending on the tool. So if you are using a tool that has been built, with all, in a walled garden, so particular some of the big companies that are working with a lot of the big law firms, they're developing their own chatbots to help their junior staff, for example, and they will have appropriate privacy safeguards. But for most people using ChatGPT or anything that's publicly available, confidentially and can be maintained. Hallucinations, I'm going to get to a case study in a second, but man, they can look really, really convincing. Made up cases, made up citations, made up facts, and they will hallucinate. So that's you may have heard, and that's just making stuff up, but it actually looks incredibly plausible. That final point is, I guess, for those of you who are running organisations, to be realistic, from looking at those stats, a lot of people are using AI, and that is a problem if IT is being used, shadow IT, if generative AI tools are being used in a way that you can't see and where you can't have the appropriate safeguards in place as an organisation. This hallucination problem is very prevalent for legal practitioners. So anyone looking to use these tools, this is a very recent example. So you may have heard some of these cases. Someone in the US has started a database where firms are being fined because they're putting in incorrect citations or arguments that don't exist on the basis of precedent that doesn't exist because they're getting it from a tool and not checking where that information has come from. So this is a really recent case in Australia, federal case, and it was just Google's generative AI application, and the other party picked up in submissions the reports that were cited they couldn't locate, and then they concluded that a lot of them had been fabricated or just incorrectly cited. And what, I guess, a few lessons here, there's obviously reputational risk, but there's also some professional legal obligations here, and also costs. So costs, interestingly, in this case, were paid personally by the applicant's solicitors. So, what Judge Murphy was saying there, it's the cost, inconvenience and delay to the parties, as well as compromising the effectiveness of the administration of justice. So the courts are taking these kinds of errors extremely seriously. So when there are now rules for all the legal practitioners out there about what you can, what you should and should not do, what you can and can't do when it comes to use of AI in your practice, I'm just summarised some of them here. The next slide, which I won't go through, is it gives you all the sources. So we have a few law societies, Queensland Law Society, and then a joint statement by New South Wales, South Australia, and WA, which are giving guidance to practitioners about how AI use is going to engage the uniform civil practice rules. So there are just some general rules. We're also getting some guidance from the courts. So Queensland, for example, has published guidance on generative AI for non-lawyers, because obviously that's going to be, and it's something I imagine you will all experience with the clients that you serve as well, that they will look to these tools. So the rules that we have for legal professionals are things like maintaining client confidentiality. So that point I made, you don't put anything that's sensitive or private into the tools. And then it's really digging down into, what legalers are ethically required to do in accordance with your practicing certificate. And the rules, the guidance from both the courts and the law societies has been that lawyers are responsible. They still are responsible. So you cannot spit out anything from an AI tool to substitute your own assessment and analysis. And that's going to cut across, whether you are using a ChatGPT kind of tool or whether you're using a Harvey AI, which is another big company working with law firms to build generative AI tools for use in practice. Again, this relate the accuracy and competence rules. So it's a requirement now. You have to ensure, just as you would with traditional legal research or any good lawyer would, is make sure that the information you're providing is accurate. You have to verify it. You have to be transparent if you're using AI with clients as well. Also related to clients is charging fair and proportionate costs. I know that's not going to be relevant to, I think, most people on this call in terms of charging charging clients for use of AI, but the guidance is clear. You can't, bill clients if AI ends up increasing the cost because of the checking that you're having to do. And then New South Wales has very specific guidance in relation to experts. And generally, there is a rule that experts are prohibited from using generative AI without leave of the court. And then there's a process in terms of being transparent if leave is granted in how you are using AI in the provision of expert reports to the court. Other jurisdictions are doing the same, I should say, in terms of producing guidance. The UK has just produced a handbook for judges on the use of AI. We're seeing also in legal practice, legal settings, we're seeing, court registries in Germany, for example, dealing with a lot of backlog of cases using AI tools. So they are cropping up everywhere. But I think what the guidance does and what the court rules have done is really narrowed down on what your legal professional obligations, what you're ethically required to do when it comes to AI, when you do want to use it in your practice. And we're going to move on in the next section for the last little bit before we stop for questions around how you approach as an organisation. I'll leave this, I think these slides will up there, but they're just some links to all the pieces of guidelines. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes, Kate, if that's right, just a few minutes. I can flick through these, but there will be, these slides will be available, and it's really some links to some resources so you can start thinking about how you use AI lawfully and responsibly. Some of these I don't think are going to be a great surprise to you, but a lot of the harms, particularly when you're talking with clients who might have been adversely impacted by AI, there are a lot of laws that apply in Australia to the use of AI. And these are tech neutral law. They're not really specifying any particular technology. And we often hear about like the digital Wild West, that no laws apply or they're difficult to apply. The bottom line is that they all do apply, and there are real challenges. AI is certainly challenging how laws do apply, but doesn't matter if you use AI or not, you still can't produce a discriminatory outcome. So there are directors' duties under corporations law. There's consumer protection laws. There's just been a recent review of ACL undertaken by the Federal Treasury. There's obviously privacy laws, and we're seeing a lot of these areas of law subject to reform processes. So, our new Attorney General said in the last few weeks that second tranche of privacy reform, which those practicing in the area will be well aware of, it is something they're working on. And there are areas of law that are being challenged by AI that are subject to reform, but the bottom line is there are a lot of laws. So you need to make sure, and organisations and individuals need to make sure that any use of AI is lawful. We're also seeing guidance emerge from regulators, specific guidance, and then we've got proposed regulation, which is what I work on, which is a whole other lecture in and of itself. You can contact me later. I'm certainly happy to talk about that at any time. But I did just want to leave you, for those of you, I'm going to skip this one just to go to the voluntary AI safety standard, because I think a lot of people are saying, I'm stealing from my colleagues from the other part of the office, and they work with organisations around corporate governance. But one tool that is really, really helpful for those organisations and those boards, because there are directors' duties that relate to how these tools are being used and responsibility for proper governance and safety mechanisms around how AI is used. One really useful resource is the voluntary AI safety standard, and I've just thrown it up on the screen here. It's a document that was produced based on the Australian AI ethics principles, which were published in about 2019. And this operationalizes those AI ethics principles, because AI ethics principles are only as good as they can be used in practice. And that's one thing that we often, a real frustration that any human rights lawyers on the call with me will share, is that ethics only gets us so far without some kind of substantive normative meaning, which is why a human rights framework is a good one to think about AI. But for those of you who are thinking about, particularly from the organizational level, about how you might use tools, certainly tools that will be coming across your desk that often promise great things and may produce great results for your organisation, the voluntary AI safety standard is a really good place to start, because it goes through, obviously don't have time to go through all of these, but it goes through some of the things that you should be thinking about, some of the questions that you should be asking. Where's this data going to be stored? Is it going offshore? Is third-party access built into this contract that I'm signing? It's thinking about human oversight. Think about engaging your stakeholders. Going back to something Kate and I were chatting about before everyone came on the call, what you do is very human. That nothing can really replace that. So really talking to your stakeholders before you start rolling out these tools and how it might benefit them. So I'm going to pause before I run out of breath. And Kate, I'm going to flip back to you for any further questions.
Right.
So go ahead, you come off mute.
Thanks so much, Sophie. That's been so fantastic to have this overview, and we can hear such a massive topic, and there's probably so many other paths that this conversation could go. We do have a few questions at the moment. So one of them is saying that for some legal software, such as Leap, there's a lot of marketing about their AI, about the AI in their software, especially for research, especially for using it for research. But then as you sign up, they say all responsibility sits with the end user to verify the information. The question is, should there be some degree of responsibility for the software providers to make sure that their work is accurate?
That is a $1 million question. I would say yes. And one thing that the government is doing is working out where liability falls, because there's no firm answer I can give you on whether Leap is responsible or you are responsible. And the fact is that they put that in their contract, which makes it a really difficult point to prove. And a lot of discussions we have been having in relation to making these voluntary AI safety standards mandatory, which would cover the situation that you're talking about, is really drilling down to who is responsible. So a lot of industry conversations I'm at, they're like, well, there's nothing much we can do if that's how it's used down the line. And that might be appropriate in some cases. But yeah, I think you really hit the nail on a really significant policy dilemma. I haven't got into much around the regulatory aspects of this, because that is that's an ongoing discussion at the moment that the federal government is having if we get to, if we have a new minister, if we start talking about mandatory guardrails, the very question you have asked is going to become a really live issue. So there is no answer to your question at the moment. And it's something that at the moment we can only test it, if there was a harm, tested in court. But I think it is a question that will have to be, and that liability question has to be understood before the government starts talking about regulation.
So we have another question here which says that for products such as Gemini, when you sign up for paid access to the product, there are terms that say um, the data will not be uploaded or not be used for any training purposes. To what extent can or should we rely on these reassurances?
Um, Also a really good question. I should say there are no easy answers to any of these questions. I mean, I think you should be able to rely on a term such as that. I'd be interested. I don't know the context of that one. I think, like any other product, you should be able to rely on statements like that. But I'd be wary. I would want to see exactly what they mean. I go back to the definitions because it would be surprising if they didn't use the data in any particular way. I think the rule at the moment, I would approach it like any other terms and conditions of products that you would use in your practice. You should be able to trust that, but I think it's really understanding the detail of those contractual terms and conditions. I think we've seen other examples, which is why I'm a little bit hesitant without having seen all the terms and conditions, where there's, I guess, different interpretations of how it's, shared with third parties, for example. Sometimes it's really obvious and sometimes it's a little hidden. But I will be reading the terms and conditions like you do with any other product you use. And then the problem is, if you are made aware that it has been used in a way or that doesn't, that is in contravention of that or is used in a slightly different way because of how the terms and conditions are constructed, the challenge then is making sure there is some kind of responsibility for that, and then use the usual challenge, use the usual channels that you would use, and there are particular challenges associated with ACL and AI at the moment. Two unsatisfactory answers, I should say. Nothing's definite here.
Sounds like it's such a complex area, and we really appreciate your insights into some of the areas of grey as well. Um, I might just do this one last question.
Yeah.
It's a question that you may not have a direct answer for, Sophie. It may actually be something that CLCQ need to go away and consider. But it's from Sibel, and it says, "How as a sector can we come together to work through the same questions we may all have about AI use to enhance access to legal information and services?" And she uses the example of how much can we use AI to help convert legal information into translate it, sorry, into other languages, and how do we work together and help each other with that? So I'm more saying that not so much because I expect you to have an answer at how we all work together, but just for the group who's all listening, it is an important consideration as far as are there opportunities that we can come together as a sector to help work together to have a similar expectations or similar way that we solve these really big, complex questions.
Yeah, I definitely don't have an answer to that question. But what I would say is that I am going to be at the National Association for CLC's conference in September. So they are having a session on AI there. My colleague Llewellyn was at New South Wales CLC's just last week. So Lou leads our AI corporate governance program. So what I can say is that these are really live issues that you are all considering. I might just pick up one, if you want further information, particularly for the questions that you were just asking then, Sabella, about how you can pull together your knowledge, some guidance. So HDR has quite a few AI governance resources that we're making publicly available to help. The final one there is my email. I would say please do reach out at any time if you have queries. Say I may not be able to answer, but I do have access to data scientists and certainly my colleagues in the corporate governance team that are working with big organizations, big banks, and then working with not-for-profits, and everywhere in between. So I would just say, please do feel free to reach out to us, because we are a not-for-profit. We're doing a lot of work with governments, I should say, and organizations, but we're not-for-profit, and certainly set up with a very, our goal, as I said at the beginning, is around human-centered use of technology, including AI. So do reach out to us. We're always interested and keen to hear from people how you're actually grappling with these issues.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sophie, for your time and expertise. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who's asked a question. Before we end the webinar, I just want to remind everyone that there'll be a feedback survey that pops up on your screen once we close the webinar. Your feedback helps us to continually improve our webinar program. We hope to see you again at the next CLCQ webinar. Bye for now. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.